It was a cold, overcast morning in Washington, D.C. The kind of morning where people wrapped their coats a little tighter, rushed their steps just a bit more, and tried to avoid eye contact with the gray skies above. Inside the district courthouse, the atmosphere was no less heavy. Security guards exchanged glances, clerks hustled through the narrow corridors with coffee in hand, and the echo of polished shoes on marble floor was a constant rhythm that filled the air. Courtroom 3B was already buzzing with quiet murmurs. Reporters were in their places, fingers on keyboards, waiting for headlines. Law students sat stiffly in the gallery, trying to hide their nerves behind notepads. Lawyers huddled in corners, brushing up last-minute notes. No one expected anything unusual. It was supposed to be another routine day in the world of justice. Just another name on the docket. Just another file to process. But fate had other plans. At exactly 9 a.m., the antique clock hanging above the judge's bench let out a solemn chime that echoed across the room. As if on cue, silence fell like a curtain being drawn. Every head turned toward the front as Judge Nathaniel Burke entered the room, his black robe flowing behind him. He was a man feared by many, unforgiving, efficient, and absolutely uninterested in emotional appeals. He took his seat, adjusted his glasses, and began flipping through the morning's files with mechanical precision. Then came a sound no one expected: the long, drawn-out creak of the courtroom's heavy wooden doors. All heads turned. Standing in the doorway was an old man. He wasn't handcuffed. He wasn't escorted by bailiffs. He walked in on his own slowly, deliberately, with a wooden cane that clicked softly with each step. His coat was faded, but meticulously clean. His white hair was combed back with care, and though his shoulders were slightly hunched from age, there was something about his presence that drew attention. He didn't look like a criminal. He didn't even look like he belonged there. His name was Walter Granger, and though none of the people in that room knew it yet, his presence would shake their entire understanding of justice. Walter moved down the center aisle with quiet dignity. Some of the younger lawyers exchanged glances. Others leaned toward each other, whispering, "Who is he?" A few scoffed, already assuming he was just another lost old man clinging to some sentimental story. But Walter didn't flinch. He reached the defendant's table and gently took his seat. His hands rested on top of his cane, knuckles pale with age, but steady. The court clerk stood up and read aloud in a formal voice. Case 712, The People versus Walter Granger. Charge: unlawful trespassing on private property. A few brows furrowed. What kind of property did he trespass on? And why? Judge Burke didn't waste a moment. He closed the file he was reading and looked down at Walter with a mixture of impatience and mild amusement. "Well, Mr. Granger," he began, his tone dripping with sarcasm, "it seems we're seeing each other again. This is the second time in less than 6 months that you've been brought before this court on the same charge. Last time, you were warned. Sternly, I might add. And yet here you are again." He leaned forward, folding his hands, and added sharply, "Would you care to explain to this court why you continue to ignore private boundaries, sir?" The silence in the room was almost reverent. All eyes turned to Walter. The old man slowly raised his head and looked at Judge Burke, not with defiance, not with fear, but with an unshakable calm. His voice, when he spoke, was soft but firm, carrying the weight of memory, of time, and something else entirely: truth. "Your Honor," he said quietly, "it wasn't a mistake. I went there because I had to." Judge Burke arched an eyebrow. "You had to," he repeated, as if the phrase offended him. "You had to walk onto the private estate of one of this country's wealthiest families, cross a locked gate, ignore warning signs, and settle yourself by a private lake?" Walter nodded slowly. "I didn't break in," he said. "The gate was already open. I didn't touch anything. I just sat by the water, the same way I did when I was a child." The judge exhaled, long and loud. "Oh, I see. Another nostalgic tale," he muttered, shaking his head. "Let me guess your grandfather owned the land, or you carved your name into a tree 50 years ago, and now you want to reclaim your childhood?" But Walter didn't blink. He straightened his back as much as he could and looked directly at the judge. "No, Your Honor," he said. "My father didn't own it. He worked on it, as the groundskeeper. I spent every Sunday of my boyhood fishing by that lake. That place was open to the public back then. It belonged to the community. And now it belongs to a man who doesn't even live there, just owns it, fences it, locks it up, and forgets it exists. For over 3 decades, Judge Nathaniel Burke had presided over courtroom after courtroom in Washington, D.C., watching defendants of all ages and backgrounds step up to face justice. He had seen the tears, the outbursts, the rehearsed speeches begging for mercy. He had heard every excuse under the sun: trauma, poverty, ignorance, regret. Yet over the years, Burke had learned one thing: the law didn't care about stories. And neither did he. He had built a reputation around his unwavering discipline. In his courtroom, emotion had no weight. Sentiment had no place. All that mattered was the statute, the facts, and the verdict. And to him, Walter Granger was just another name. Another man who had trespassed where he shouldn't have. Again, he cleared his throat and spoke, his voice echoing through the packed courtroom, hard and cold as iron. "Mr. Granger," he began, each word cutting through the silence. "Trespassing on private property is a clear violation of federal law. You were warned once, and yet you deliberately repeated the offense. What that place once was, or what it meant to you in your past, is irrelevant in the eyes of the law. It is no longer public. It was sold. It now belongs to a private citizen. Entering it without permission is illegal. Period." Walter Granger lowered his head slightly, as if receiving the words not with shame, but with acceptance. A soft, almost wistful smile flickered in the corners of his lips. When he looked up, his eyes shimmered with something rare in that courtroom. Not defiance, not guilt, but stillness. The kind of stillness that comes from knowing who you are, even if no one else does. "I understand, Your Honor," he said, in a voice calm yet steeped in emotion. Judge Burke frowned. Something in the old man's tone made him uneasy. This wasn't the typical defendant who dodged guilt or tried to spin a sob story. Walter wasn't denying his actions. He wasn't even asking for forgiveness. No, he was pointing to something else. And that uncertainty scraped at Burke's resolve like sandpaper against stone. "If you understand," the judge said, his voice rising slightly, "then tell this court why you did it again. Why did you knowingly walk onto restricted land?" Walter gave the smallest shrug. The movement was slow, almost weary, like the gesture cost him something. He lowered his eyes for a beat, gathering his thoughts, then lifted them again, this time locking onto the judge with a steady, unwavering gaze. "Because," he said slowly, his voice filled with quiet weight, "there are some things you can only see if you go back. Some truths can only be heard in the silence of the past." The words settled over the courtroom like falling ash. For a long moment, no one spoke. Even the spectators in the gallery, who minutes ago were shuffling and whispering, sat in stunned silence. Then a murmur rippled through the room, people exchanging glances, leaning toward one another, wondering what exactly the old man had meant. Judge Burke shifted uncomfortably in his chair. He didn't like riddles. He didn't like being thrown off balance in his courtroom. And yet, something in those words clung to him. They weren't just sentimental reflections, they were a message, a warning, or perhaps a buried truth resurfacing after years of silence. Still, he had a job to do. He slammed his palm down on the bench with a sharp crack. "Mr. Granger," he snapped, "I'm not here to indulge poetic metaphors. I want the truth, not riddles. Tell this court clearly, why did you go back to that property?" But in the judge's eyes, a flicker of doubt had appeared, because he had a sudden, chilling feeling. Walter Granger had not come to be judged. He had come to reveal something. Judge Nathaniel Burke squinted at the old man standing before him, taking in every detail from his patched-up coat to the scuffed leather shoes, and the cane that seemed more like a burden than support. Walter Granger looked like he had walked straight out of a forgotten time, or perhaps out of a back alley. In a courtroom polished with marble, filled with suits and ties, he stood out like a faded photograph in a digital world. Burke's lips curled into a faint, almost imperceptible smirk. He leaned slightly forward and spoke with a cool, biting tone that echoed through the room. Well, look at you, Mr. Granger. You walk into a federal courtroom dressed like you've just come from a soup kitchen. Tattered coat, no tie, shoes worn through the soles." He raised an eyebrow, voice laced with disdain. "No wonder you don't have a lawyer. I assume you couldn't afford one." The room tensed. Some of the spectators turned their eyes away, uncomfortable. Others leaned forward, drawn in by the rawness of the moment. A few young interns even chuckled under their breath. Burke noticed and didn't stop them. Walter stood still. He didn't lower his gaze. He didn't shift on his feet. He stood there, rooted, with the kind of calm that made even silence feel loud. Judge Burke wasn't finished. "You see, in this court, appearances matter," he said, gesturing with his hand. "Respect matters. You don't just stroll into my courtroom dressed like you've been sleeping under a bridge and expect me to take you seriously. And now you want to tell me what? That the law doesn't apply to you? That your childhood memories give you the right to trespass?" Walter raised his head slightly. There was no anger in his eyes. No pride, either. Just quiet strength. "I never said that," he replied. Burke folded his arms. "Then what exactly are you saying, Mr. Granger? You stand here without a lawyer, without a defense, without even a sense of urgency. You treat this courtroom like some kind of confessional booth for your past. Is that what this is?" Walter simply shook his head, slow and deliberate. "I don't need a lawyer," he said. His voice was steady, unshaken by the mockery. "And I'm not here to defend myself." Burke blinked. The words hit harder than expected. "You're not here to defend yourself?" he repeated, incredulous. That was unheard of. In all his years on the bench, not once had a defendant so calmly rejected not just defense but the very premise of being judged. A wave of murmurs rippled through the courtroom again. The judge narrowed his eyes. "Mr. Granger," he said, leaning forward again, voice now harsher, colder, "you broke the law. That's not a debate. You walked onto private land, again, without permission. And in this courtroom, I decide what happens next. That's how it works. That's justice. So I'll ask you again, who do you think decides what happens here?" Walter was quiet for a long moment. Then, with a small, almost invisible smile, he lifted his head and answered with only one sentence. It was soft, but it cut through the tension like glass. "Sometimes the one who gives the answer isn't the one who asked the question." And with that, silence once again fell over the courtroom, this time heavier, deeper, because beneath the man in ragged clothes, Judge Nathaniel Burke stared at the old man with narrowed eyes. His posture was upright, but a trace of disbelief flickered in his face. Something about this whole situation was beginning to feel off. The silence that had settled over the courtroom was dense and growing heavier by the second. Walter Granger, unshaken as ever, tilted his head slightly and spoke in a calm, composed voice. "Your Honor," he said softly, "may I make a phone call?" A wave of murmurs swept through the gallery like a gust of wind. Heads turned. Eyebrows rose. Who was this man calling? And more importantly, why now? Judge Burke leaned forward slowly, placing both palms flat on the wooden bench in front of him. His voice dropped an octave, tightening like a cord. "Mr. Granger," he said sternly, "this is a federal courtroom. You don't just make phone calls at your convenience. This is not your living room." Walter didn't flinch. His gaze was level, his voice steady. "If you're going to give me 30 days in jail," he said, almost matter-of-factly, "I would like to inform my daughter. I believe she deserves to know." For a moment, there was no sound. Even the court stenographer paused, unsure whether to keep typing. A strange chill seemed to pass through the room. Several people exchanged nervous glances. One of the bailiffs shifted in place, unsure whether to intervene. Judge Burke let out a long, slow exhale. He rolled his eyes slightly, as if exhausted by this unexpected drama, and waved his hand. "Fine," he muttered, his voice tight with annoyance. "But let's keep this performance short." Walter nodded once in quiet gratitude. He walked slowly but purposefully toward the desk phone near the witness stand. Every eye in the courtroom followed his movements. His cane tapped lightly against the floor, and yet his hand, when he reached for the phone, did not tremble. He picked up the receiver, dialed without hesitation. He knew the number by heart. He brought the phone to his ear and spoke only one sentence, clear and deliberate. "Katrina, it's time to come." And then he gently placed the receiver back down. No explanation, no emotion, just those words. A new wave of whispers swept through the courtroom. "Who's Katrina?" someone whispered from the back. A defense attorney leaned toward her colleague, lips barely moving. "Did he say Katrina Granger? No, it can't be." Confusion mixed with anticipation. Something was unraveling and no one knew what. Judge Burke's eyes narrowed. He didn't like games. "All right, Mr. Granger," he said, his voice like ice. "Now that your little act is finished, can we return to the matter at hand? Or would you like to send for a marching band next?" Walter gave no response. He merely turned, walked back to his seat, and sat down silently, his hands resting gently on his cane. And just as Judge Burke was about to continue, the doors burst open, not slowly, not politely, but with purpose. Everyone turned. A woman stepped into the courtroom. She wore a long black wool coat over a sharp-cut navy suit. Her hair was tied back with sleek precision. The sound of her high heels striking the hardwood floor echoed like the beat of a war drum. Her presence was undeniable, controlled, powerful, and ice-cold. Two men in tailored suits followed closely behind her, each carrying leather briefcases. Their faces were unreadable. They moved like professionals who had done this before. The woman didn't hesitate. She walked straight to Walter Granger. When she reached him, she bent slightly, placed a hand gently on his shoulder, and said in a voice that was soft but shook the room, "Dad, are you all right?" Gasps erupted from every corner. One man stood up involuntarily. A journalist dropped her notepad. People exchanged frantic glances as realization dawned. The woman standing before them was Katrina Granger, CEO of Granger International, one of the most powerful private holding companies in the United States. A woman seen on news channels, in business magazines, in headlines. Her net worth alone could fund entire cities. Judge Burke froze. His fingers slowly curled around the edge of the bench. He blinked once, then twice, but the image didn't change. The man he had just mocked for his coat, his shoes, his lack of a lawyer, was the father of one of the wealthiest, most influential women in the country. The courtroom, once filled with assumption and arrogance, now sat in stunned silence. Everything had changed. And Walter Granger? He hadn't moved, hadn't smiled, hadn't said a word. Because he knew. He knew all along. They were about to find out who he really was. The room had not yet recovered from the shock of Katrina Granger's sudden appearance when her voice cut through the silence like a scalpel. She turned slowly from her father to face the bench. Her heels echoed faintly as she stepped forward, each movement deliberate and powerful. The courtroom moments ago so confident in its judgment now watched her with rapt attention. And then she spoke. "Your Honor." Her voice was calm, but razor sharp. "They didn't just put my father on trial today." The words hung in the air like thunder before a storm. Gasps rippled through the gallery. The reporters were frozen in place, their fingers hovering over keyboards. Even the bailiffs looked uncertain. Judge Burke, who had leaned back in his chair moments earlier with the air of a man in complete control, now sat rigid. His hands clenched the edge of the bench. His composure, once impenetrable, had begun to crack. Katrina took another step forward. "You've dragged him into this courtroom," she continued, her voice steady, but her jaw tight, "and reduced him to a trespasser, a vagrant, a man who, in your eyes, didn't belong here not because of what he did, but because of how he looked." The weight of her words struck like a hammer. You didn't ask who he was. You didn't care. You saw an old man in a worn coat and assumed he was no one, that he mattered less, that he deserved less. Judge Burke opened his mouth slightly, but nothing came out. Katrina's tone grew colder, now controlled fury, wrapped in clarity. "You condemned him not because of what he did, but because of how he looked. Because he didn't look like someone who could own anything, or know anything, or be anything." The spectators shifted in their seats. The discomfort in the room was now impossible to ignore. Those who had laughed under their breath when Walter entered, those who had whispered behind cupped hands, were now staring at their own shoes. Katrina inhaled deeply, and then she dropped the weight of the truth. "My father is not who you think he is." Every head lifted. "He is Walter Granger," she said firmly, "co-founder of Granger International, the man whose vision built the very company I now run. The man who chose to step away from wealth, from status, from boardrooms because he believed in something more important than power." Her voice trembled now not from weakness, but from the deep emotion pulsing behind every word. "And today, you tried to strip him of his dignity, publicly, as if that suit you wear and that bench you sit behind make you the only one allowed to speak with authority." She stepped closer, her eyes never leaving Judge Burke's. "And now, Your Honor," she said quietly, but intensely, "you're the one on trial." For a moment time stopped. Judge Burke sat frozen, his gaze locked with Katrina's. Everything in his expression, certainty, arrogance, superiority, was crumbling beneath the weight of what had just been revealed. This was no longer a simple hearing. This was a mirror held up to the justice system. And what it showed was uncomfortable. The people in the courtroom, jurors, attorneys, journalists, onlookers each felt it in their bones. This wasn't about property. It wasn't even about law. It was about respect, truth, humanity. And in that moment, Walter Granger sat silently in his seat, still dressed in the same faded coat, still leaning gently on his cane, still wearing that quiet, knowing smile. Because for him, this wasn't revenge. It wasn't pride. It was something far simpler and far deeper: restoration. Your Honor, Katrina Granger began again, her voice cold and unwavering. You didn't just ignore my father's rights. You mocked him. Her eyes remained locked with Judge Burke's, unblinking, unwavering. You looked at his coat, his shoes, his silence, and you judged him not as a citizen, not as a man, but as someone beneath your attention. The room had fallen into complete silence once again, a thick, tense quiet that wrapped around every spectator like fog. Every eye was fixed on Katrina. In that moment, she wasn't just the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar firm, she was the voice of justice that the courtroom had forgotten. You laughed behind your authority, she continued. You insulted his dignity, and you treated him as if poverty or what looked like poverty made him less human. And then she delivered the blow, which is why, following your ruling today, I will be taking legal action against you, Your Honor. Personally, it was a sentence that hit like a gavel slamming into stone. Gasps echoed. Someone in the gallery audibly whispered, "Oh my God." Another covered her mouth with both hands. The court reporter paused mid-keystroke, stunned. Judge Burke sat frozen for a moment. Then color slowly drained from his face. It had already been harrowing enough to discover that the man he'd mocked was actually Walter Granger, co-founder of Granger International, a business legend in disguise. But this? Legal action? Personal consequences? His hand trembled slightly as he reached into his robe pocket and pulled out a handkerchief. He dabbed the sweat collecting on his forehead. The man who had, just an hour ago, ruled the courtroom like a king now looked like someone awaiting his own sentencing. The bailiff cleared his throat cautiously, stepping forward. Your Honor, he said gently, you still need to deliver your verdict. Judge Burke blinked slowly, then straightened in his chair. His voice was hoarse when he finally spoke. Yes, of course. He swallowed, paused, and tried to gather the last shreds of composure. He cleared his throat and, with effort, forced out the words, "The charges against Mr. Walter Granger are hereby dismissed." There was a murmur of relief in the courtroom. Heads nodded, breaths were exhaled. Yet amidst that wave, Walter remained still silent, observing. The judge lifted his voice. The defendant is declared not guilty. The words echoed. But Walter Granger still did not move. He simply sat there, hands resting calmly on his cane, eyes fixed on the judge. It wasn't the verdict he had come for. He was waiting for something else, something deeper. Judge Burke felt it. He shifted awkwardly, avoiding the old man's gaze for as long as he could. Then, finally, he looked up, and when he spoke again, the voice was no longer that of a confident authority but of a man exposed. Mr. Granger, he said slowly, I apologize for the time you spent here, for the way this was handled. Walter tilted his head slightly. Then, with a faint smile, not of triumph, but of tired wisdom, he replied, An apology, Your Honor, doesn't undo what happened. A hush fell once again, and then Katrina stepped forward. Her voice was sharp, now precise. Especially, she said, when that apology only comes after you found out who he really is. You didn't apologize to a man in a coat. You apologized to a name. The judge turned his face to the side, visibly embarrassed. His authority had all but collapsed. But Katrina wasn't finished. She reached into her handbag, pulled out a thick manila envelope, and walked to the bench. She laid it down gently in front of him and slid it across the polished wood. One last thing, Your Honor, she said, her voice now colder than ever. You may want to read this. Judge Burke hesitated. Then he slowly opened the envelope. Inside were documents official, sealed, and marked. His hands trembled slightly as he flipped through the pages. His eyes darted across legal language, notarized declarations, attached statements. And then they stopped. His face went pale. His jaw clenched. He swallowed. Because what he saw, what Katrina had just handed him, was not just a legal threat. It was a fully prepared lawsuit, filed, backed by the most powerful attorneys in the state, on the grounds of judicial misconduct, public defamation, and abuse of authority. The very system he once controlled was now turning on him. And Katrina Granger still stood tall, her expression unreadable. This courtroom had once judged her father, but now it had witnessed the fall of a judge who forgot that justice was not about status. It was about truth. Katrina Granger stepped forward, her heels clicking sharply on the polished floor. She didn't break eye contact with Judge Burke. Her voice, once calm, now carried the chilling clarity of authority. Granger Capital has been running a special justice initiative for the past 6 months, she said coldly. This fund supports underfunded court systems across the country. She paused for a brief moment, long enough to let the weight of her next words settle in the air. And coincidentally, one of the largest beneficiaries of that fund is the District Courthouse of Washington, D.C. The courtroom gasped in unison. Some spectators covered their mouths. The realization sank like an anchor. Reporters stared, stunned, unsure whether to jot it down or just watch history unfold. What they were witnessing wasn't just a defense, it was an indictment of the system itself. Walter Granger slowly raised his head. His eyes, though weary from time and memory, were firm and steady. He looked directly at Judge Burke. There was no hatred in his gaze, no resentment, just clarity. Sad, disappointed clarity. The judge tried to avert his eyes, but he couldn't. Walter's expression held him in place. It was more than a stare, it was a lifetime of truth. Walter spoke slowly, his voice carrying a calm authority. You made your biggest mistake right there, Mr. Judge. He paused. The silence in the courtroom grew denser, as if the very walls were holding their breath. You thought I was poor. The words echoed off the stone, the wood, and the bones of every soul in the room. No one moved. The shame was no longer just the judge's, it belonged to everyone who had judged Walter by his coat, his cane, his silence. Walter waited, letting the weight of his words rest in the room. Then, finally, he added, and at that moment, you stopped trying to understand who I really am. The entire courtroom seemed to collapse into stillness. No more whispers, no more clicks of pens, no more glances passed between spectators. Because this wasn't just about one man. It was about the collective failure to see beyond appearances. It was about how society views wealth, status, and power, and how justice too often is shaped by assumption. Katrina stepped beside her father. Though she stood tall as the head of a powerful corporation, her eyes betrayed something deeper, a daughter's pride, pain, and fierce protection. Let's go, Dad, she said gently. Walter nodded. He rose from his chair slowly, leaning on his cane, but with a posture that no longer seemed old or frail. He stood with quiet strength, head held high. At that moment, no one saw an aging man, they saw someone who had reclaimed not only his identity, but his dignity. As the doors to the courtroom opened, a cold, clear light spilled in from the corridor. Outside, cameras flashed and microphones bristled in the hands of dozens of journalists. The world had heard what happened inside, but inside the courtroom, there was only silence. Judge Burke sat at the bench, his head lowered, his hands visibly trembling. He no longer looked like the man who had confidently mocked Walter Granger an hour ago. The robe no longer gave him power. The gavel no longer gave him control. Because now, he was the one being judged. Katrina reached into her coat and pulled out one final envelope. She placed it on the judge's desk and slid it toward him. I'd like to leave you with one last piece of information, she said, her tone like ice. Judge Burke opened the envelope with shaky hands. Inside were legal documents, dozens of pages of prepared litigation, accusations of misconduct, conflicts of interest, and proof of systemic bias. His face paled with every line he read. And then Walter turned back one last time. You know, Your Honor, he said softly, the only reason I came here was to see how justice works. He took a few steps, the sound of his shoes quiet but firm. And what I saw didn't surprise me. He paused. The whole room waited for the final word. For justice, he said slowly, is often judged by the thickness of a man's wallet. And with that, he turned again, walked forward, and never looked back. If this story moved you, don't just watch, be part of something greater. Subscribe to our channel for more stories that uncover injustice, challenge assumptions, and reveal the hidden truths behind everyday lives. Like, comment, and share because sometimes a single story can change the way we see the world. And remember, the next truth is only one story away.